Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so if you really want to understand ancient Roman sexuality, you basically have to discard almost everything you think you know about sexual identity today.
That's right.
We organize our world, around who people love orientation, right? Gay, straight, bi. Rome. They didn't really care about affection in the same way. It cared about power, pure and simple.
That's absolutely the crux of it, yeah. Our deep dive today, it's built on quite expensive analysis of Roman sexual culture. We're looking at, fragments of legal codes, some pretty scathing poetry from political rivals.
Right, the insults.
Oh, definitely. And even surviving visual artifacts, things like drinking cups. So our mission really is to reconstruct a paradigm that was just rigidly defined by dominance.
And we are focusing specifically on the receptive partner, what we might, informally call the bottom in today's terms. In Rome, taking this role, it was never just a neutral choice or like a simple preference.
No, absolutely not.
It was a huge social status marker. If you were an enslaved person or maybe a professional prostitute, okay, the receptive role was kind of expected, right? It was your legally degraded function almost.
That was the structure.
But if you were a freeborn citizen, a vir, as they called them, taking that role, that was a personal disaster. A moral failure even, and a massive political liability that could totally end your career.
The entire system really hinges on this one core principle, the active-passive dichotomy, the act of penetration itself. It was less about intimacy, much less, and more about making this profound political, social, and, moral statement about who commanded whom. You were either the subject, the one acting, or you were the object, the one acted upon, the object of power. Okay,
so today we're really unpacking the deep structural constraints that made being the receptive partner a sign of, permanent legal and social inferiority. And as we lay out this whole structure, we really want you, the listener, to grapple with this kind of strange idea. Why on earth was the sexual role of a Roman citizen, even something happening in the privacy of his own home, why was that a matter of public governance and political survival?
Yeah, it goes way beyond just private morality.
It really does.
Yeah.
It was far more than just a moral issue. Okay, let's dive in. Let's start with the absolute non-negotiable foundation of Roman sexual morality. It was totally tied up with the act of penetration.
Absolutely central.
In Roman eyes, the penetrator. He was always the social superior. Always. And the penetrated person. Always the inferior. This wasn't just, a cultural preference. It was fundamental. A structural relationship that kind of mirrored the state itself.
And that setup, it creates this immediate and frankly heavy burden of obligation for the freeborn male citizen. He was socially, legally, and morally sort of compelled to adopt the active penetrating role. It didn't matter who the partner was. Their gender was irrelevant in this context.
So woman, male slave, prostitute.
Didn't matter. His role had to be dominant. This active stance was the very foundation of his political freedom, his libertas. If he chose passivity, he was essentially opting out of his whole political and social identity. It was that serious.
Wow. And this obligation, this pressure, it brings us directly to the heart of Roman masculinity, this concept of virtus. Now, when we translate virtus just as manliness, we lose so much, don't we?
Oh, massively. It's such a weighty term. It covers moral excellence, self-discipline, certainly courage in war, but fundamentally it was about the capacity to govern, both himself and others.
Okay.
So to be a true vir, you had to maintain virtus constantly.
So asserting that dominant role in sex?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about personal ego then?
Not at all. It was actually mandatory for maintaining virtus. And the logic was, the Romans believed self-control was indivisible.
Ah, I see.
If you showed a failure to control your own body, your desires, your behavior in the bedroom by accepting submission, how could anyone possibly trust you to control the legions or the state treasury or the entire populace of this vast Roman state?
Right. It makes a kind of brutal sense in their framework.
It does.
And this is where the source material gets really interesting, because it argues that the act of penetration itself almost functioned as a kind of political microcosm.
Like a little ritual.
Exactly. A ritualistic affirmation carried out, one act at a time, of the citizen's inherent right to command the republic and later the empire. It was like a micro reenactment of the whole patriarchal power structure. So this wasn't really about finding pleasure or connection, not primarily anyway. It was about validating the entire political hierarchy from the top down. And so the willingness to be penetrated, that was seen as just a catastrophic failure of self-control.
Which rendered the citizen functionally soft, or mollus, as they'd say.
Mollus. Soft, and therefore completely unfit for command.
And this structural requirement, this pressure, it directly creates the intense social stigma around the receptive role, but specifically for a citizen. The rules were crystal clear on this.
Okay.
A Roman man, a vir, could use, well, virtually unlimited sexual subjects. This included women, slaves, prostitutes of both sexes.
So quite a wide range of partners was acceptable, provided he was the active one.
Precisely. But he was legally and morally absolutely prohibited from taking the passive role himself if he was a freeborn citizen. That line was completely inviolable.
I think we really need to hammer that distinction home for everyone listening. The sexual act itself, penetration between two men, that seems to have been pretty ubiquitous among the elite. It was even joked about, right?
Yes, constantly in literature.
The actual problem wasn't the gender of the partner involved, it was the status of the person submitting. That was the critical factor.
Exactly right. And when that rule was breached, or even just accused of being breached, when a citizen was said to have accepted penetration, especially from maybe a social equal or, God forbid, someone lesser,
Oh boy.
that triggered immediate and intense social and political scandal. This wasn't just sort of frowned upon, it was seen as a profound transgression against mos maiorum.
The traditional social norms.
Yes, the ancestral customs, the moral compass for the Republic and the Empire. Breaching this undermined the entire concept of what it meant to be a Roman citizen, a Roman vir.
Okay, so just to structure this clearly for everyone listening, let's quickly summarize this foundational dichotomy that our sources lay out so starkly. On one side, if you were the active partner, you were the vir, the ideal citizen.
Yeah, the goal.
You were associated with virtus, manliness,
Yeah.
self-control, political eligibility. You held the dominant, the superior position. It was expected.
And then on the other side, you had the acceptable passive partner. This could be a slave, a professional male prostitute, an exoletus, or perhaps a younger male who wasn't a citizen. These individuals were associated with infamia.
Infamia, lack of honor.
Lack of honor, yeah, legal degradation. Their role was essentially duty-based, tied to their status. Their submission was acceptable, even necessary, precisely because their status was already beneath that of the citizen. They weren't expected to have virtus.
Okay, and then there was the third, really problematic category.
Yeah.
The forbidden passive partner. This is the Pathicus, the citizen who willingly submitted.
The key word being willingly.
This person was associated with morbus dolor, which means
Sickness. But not just physical sickness, moral failure, corruption. It was considered deeply shameful, a subject for political annihilation, and it carried severe legal risk.
so the difference between an acceptable bottom and a forbidden one wasn't the act itself, but entirely a matter of life-defining status.
Absolutely. Status was everything.
And the Romans, they didn't just have one generic insult for the receptive male citizen. They had this incredibly precise, layered taxonomy of contempt, which again just proves that the status of the individual involved is absolutely everything. They were masters of categorization, weren't they?
They really were, especially when it came to social hierarchy and shame. And we absolutely have to start with the term Pathicus because this is the label that truly seems to have horrified the Roman elite.
Okay.
It specifically described an adult male citizen who, and this is crucial, willingly took the receptive role. The word itself, it comes from the Greek paschine, which means to suffer or to submit in a passive sense.
So the term itself implies submission.
Exactly. It was reserved for what they saw as a voluntary failure of masculinity.
And the nature of the scorn directed at the Pathicus. It seems truly visceral in the sources. He was depicted as, something less than a man, weaker, polluted somehow.
Yes, and the sources confirm that this condemnation wasn't just, simple moralizing. It was actually described in terms of a sickness, a morbus.
Morbus again, sickness.
Yes, and that term morbus is so critical here. They weren't primarily condemning the specific sexual act itself. Remember, that act was fine with a slave or prostitute. They were condemning the desire that supposedly drove the citizen to want that act.
The desire for submission.
Exactly. The sickness was the failure of internal self-control, the corrupted will, this unnatural desire for submission, which was a direct offense against virtus. This wasn't about modern psychology, of course. It was seen as a profound philosophical and political failing.
So the Pathicus was basically denounced for his voluntary desire to be used as a receptacle.
Pretty much. A desire that was interpreted as a physical manifestation of his, complete moral inadequacy. It just confirms Roman society's obsession with the failure of the individual will. That failure worried them far more than any concern about the gender of the sexual partner.
And the political rhetoric around this kind of alleged failure, it must have been savage.
Absolutely brutal. If you were accused of being a Pathicus, you were immediately targeted with a whole host of associated insults designed to just degrade your entire public persona.
Like what?
Well, one key term was synodistal. Now, this term originally referred to a type of Greek dancer known for sort of effeminate movements, but it very quickly became conflated with Pathicus in Roman usage. It was thrown around to imply a total failure to uphold the ideal of the fair. It was basically the ultimate Roman accusation of effeminacy, of not being a real man.
And you also mentioned mollus earlier.
Yes, mollus, which simply means soft. It's just an adjective.
Yeah.
But used in this context, it implies a total lack of the rigidity, the toughness, the self-control deemed necessary for Roman masculinity.
So calling a politician mollus.
Was like saying he was literally spineless, pliable, completely unfit for the harsh realities of command, whether military or political. These terms weren't just playful schoolyard insults, they were weapons of character assassination.
Okay, but now let's pivot completely. Let's contrast that intense societal scorn aimed squarely at the citizen Pathicus with the, well, utterly acceptable bottoms who were drawn from the professional and servile classes.
Right, a total contrast.
These individuals were actually essential to the system, weren't they? They fulfilled this functional, though obviously highly degraded, sexual role. And in doing so, they kind of insulated the citizens' virtus from judgment.
The system simply couldn't function without them. They provided the necessary, socially sanctioned outlet for elite men's active desires. And Rome, being ever practical, had specific terminology for these individuals too, reinforcing their legal non-status.
Okay, so let's break down that specific taxonomy of the acceptable bottom. You mentioned the term exoletus before. That sounds quite specific.
It is very specific. This was an adult male prostitute, generally someone over the age of 18 who worked for hire. The literal translation of the term grown-up man or worn out kind of underscores that this person was past the typical age of a desirable youth, but was still available sexually as a commodity.
Interesting. And what about scordum?
Scordum tolls was a more general term, and interestingly, it was gender neutral. It could refer to any sex worker or prostitute, male or female.
Okay. And the key link for all these professional or servile classes, the exoleti, the scorda, you said they were legally designated infames.
Yes, infames. And that term is absolutely central to understanding how this whole system worked legally and socially.
What did infames mean in practice?
It meant they were legally stripped of social standing and honor. They lost fundamental rights, the right to testify in court in many cases, the right to hold any kind of public office, the right to enjoy many of the legal protections that were automatically afforded to citizens. They were, in effect, legally degraded, almost transformed into non-persons in the eyes of the law and respectable society.
Wow. So this legalized degradation, it wasn't a bug, it was a feature.
It was the system operating exactly as intended. By stripping them of honor, Roman law transformed them into acceptable, even necessary partners for the citizens seeking same-sex penetration.
Because their lack of status removed the threat to the citizens' virtus.
Precisely. They weren't condemned for their passivity like the Pathicus was. Their passivity was simply seen as an economic function, a consequence stemming directly from their lack of status.
So just to sum that up, the Exoletus, the professional, wasn't seen as a moral failure for being receptive. He was just doing his job, a kind of duty derived from his low status. But the Pathicus, the citizen, was hated and feared for voluntarily choosing the exact same role, a choice that threatened the very foundations of his citizenship and implied this deep moral corruption, this morbus.
It's a really remarkable illustration, isn't it, how the morality of a specific act depended entirely on the legal standing, the status, of the person performing it or submitting to it.
Absolutely stark.
Yeah.
Status defined everything.
And this crucial distinction between the condemned citizen Pathicus and the necessary commodity, the infamous bottom, it was so vital to the Roman conception of power and order that it was actually codified into law.
Right.
And the primary legal instrument we hear about, though it's often quite vague in the sources, was the Lex Scantinia.
Okay, the Lex Scantinia. This is the law that everyone sort of references when they talk about Roman anti-homosexual statutes, isn't it?
It is, but the sources, when you look closely, provide really crucial context. The Lex Scantinia was almost certainly not a blanket law designed to criminalize all same-sex acts across the board.
No. What was its focus then?
Its focus seems to have been laser-sharp, protecting the political and, crucially, the physical integrity of the citizen's body, specifically from penetration. The law didn't prohibit a citizen from penetrating a slave or an exoletus. That was perfectly acceptable.
Okay, so it policed the citizen's role, not the act itself.
Exactly. Roman legal ideology was just fixated on maintaining the inviolability of the freeborn male's masculine honor, his dignitas and virtus. So the law structurally restricted the citizen's sexual choices, essentially channeling his active desires towards those outside the core body politic: prostitutes, slaves, foreigners.
So if we needed any more proof that the law's main concern was primarily about the maintenance of social status purity and not really about some kind of universal sexual morality, this is it, right?
This is absolutely it. The law functioned as a legal mechanism for reinforcing that rigid social hierarchy. It was about ensuring that the passive role, the ultimate symbol of submission, could never touch the body or, more importantly, the status of a potential political leader. Now, while the specific original text of the Lex Scantinia is unfortunately lost to us.
We don't have the exact wording.
No, we don't. But what does survive are numerous references, particularly in political speeches and historical accounts, to its application. And historically, it seems to have functioned less as a routinely enforced criminal statute against everyday people.
And more as
a potent judicial and, perhaps even more often, a rhetorical tool. A weapon, really, for harassing and discrediting political opponents.
Okay, now this is where it gets really fascinating, because it moves away from just legal abstraction and straight into the cut and thrust of Roman political drama. Let's talk about the use of this law as a weapon.
It was perfect for that.
Accusations of being a passive citizen, a Pathicus, they must have been utterly devastating.
Oh, completely. We know that political rivals frequently deployed this charge. Think about the intense rivalry between, say, Cicero and his enemies like Catiline or Clodius. Accusations flew back and forth.
And wasn't there that famous repeated accusation against Julius Caesar?
Absolutely. The notorious claim that early in his career, Caesar had been the receptive partner, the Queen of Bithynia, they called him, of King Nicomedes IV.
Wow.
That accusation, whether true or not, followed Caesar for decades. His opponents constantly brought it up to question his virtuous, to imply he wasn't fit to lead Rome.
So the charge itself, even just the rumor, could be enough to destroy a politician's standing.
Often, yes, because it immediately implied that catastrophic failure of self-control, and therefore, by Roman logic, unfitness to lead the state. The Lex Scantinia, in effect, served almost as a kind of constitutional definition of masculine political eligibility.
That's a powerful way to put it.
If you were accused, credibly or not, of being a passive citizen, your fundamental ability to command respect, command troops, command the state itself, was immediately questioned in the Senate and by the general populace.
And what about the penalties? Were they actually enforced? Sources mention quite severe ones.
They do. Some sources mention a massive fine, potentially 10,000 sesterces, which was a huge amount of money. Others even hint at the possibility of capital punishment, though that's less certain and probably rarer.
But the main power wasn't necessarily in the enforcement.
Exactly. The law's true. Day-to-day power seems to have resided in its very existence as a threat. It was this potent sword hanging over the head of every ambitious citizen, a potential tool for rivals. We see this reflected in the quite sporadic nature of its actual enforcement recorded in history. It wasn't consistently used against private citizens doing things in private, not until certain emperors, like the famously autocratic Domitian, decided to dust it off.
Why did he do that?
Usually as part of larger, often politically motivated moral reform campaigns, efforts aimed at enforcing traditional Roman behavior, often to shore up their own authority or attack enemies. But even then, its primary power was as that ever-present legal lever for rivals to try and strip a man of his legitimacy by attacking his sexual honor.
Okay. Now, this whole framework, this obsession with the citizen's honor, it contrasts so sharply with the legal reality for the servile body, right?
Completely different world.
We need to be really clear here. For the enslaved male in Rome, his receptive sexual experience was viewed fundamentally through the lens of property law.
That's the absolute key legal distinction. Sexual offenses involving slaves were not matters of honor, because honor, in the Roman legal sense, was a quality reserved only for free individuals, primarily citizens.
So terms like stuprum, which meant illicit sexual conduct, usually involving free women, but sometimes freeborn boys, those terms just didn't apply to slaves.
Generally, no. When the Roman legal system looked at sexual conduct involving slaves, whether male or female, it was almost entirely through the lens of property law.
So an offense against a slave's body, including acts that we would absolutely consider non-consensual sexual assault, How was that classified in the Roman legal evidence?
It was typically classified as the misuse or damage of property. Damnum injuria datum.
Damage to property.
Yes. These actions would usually fall under the provisions of the Lex Scantinia, which was the major Roman statute governing damage to property, like injury to livestock or damage to goods.
That's incredibly dehumanizing.
It is, from our perspective. The slave's body was legally considered a commodity, an asset belonging to the owner, and therefore the key determinant of its sexual accessibility wasn't consent of the enslaved person, but the consent or command of the owner.
So what would inflict mortal shame and legal jeopardy on a free person being used as a receptive sexual object was often viewed quite differently for a slave?
Yes. For a slave, it could often be viewed as merely fulfilling an expected, sometimes even required, duty. A duty that sprang directly from their inherently degraded legal status as property. The law primarily protected the owner's asset and the owner's rights to use or dispose of that asset, not the slave's personhood or bodily integrity in any meaningful way.
So this legal structure perfectly complemented the social need for acceptable passive partners, didn't it? It provided a legally sanctioned pool of bodies.
Exactly. The law itself helped create and maintain the supply that the social structure demanded. So the system we've been outlining, it creates this kind of structural paradox, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, the citizen is morally and legally prohibited from passive sex because it violates his virtus. Yet, that same virtus demands that he be sexually active, dominant.
Okay, I see. So where does that active drive go?
Exactly. It means that Roman sexual culture had to be structurally reliant on a vast, institutionalized supply of legally disposable individuals. The infames class we talked about.
Right, the people stripped of honor.
Yes, and this wasn't just some random collection of unfortunate individuals. This was a recognized, almost necessary caste within Roman society. It included sex slaves, professional prostitutes like the exoleti. This caste was maintained, even institutionalized, specifically to absorb the sexual demands of the elite.
Without causing a moral or political crisis for the citizen penetrator.
Precisely. It was a structural necessity for maintaining the integrity and the clear boundaries of the citizenship hierarchy.
And we actually have tangible evidence of this institutional reliance, don't we? It wasn't hidden away.
Not at all. The sources discuss and depict male sex work quite openly. I mean, the most famous example probably is the sheer amount of graffiti found scrawled all over the walls of brothels and taverns in places like Pompeii.
What does the graffiti say?
Well, it often names specific individuals, sometimes boasts about encounters, occasionally even lists prices. It confirms that male prostitutes were a highly visible, recognized feature of Roman daily life, often identified by those specific terms like exoletus or sometimes just pure boy, even if they were adults.
And there's also some interesting, though perhaps limited, economic data about this, suggesting male prostitutes might have received some compensation.
Yes, there are hints. Sometimes maybe a percentage of their earnings if they worked for a pimp or brothel owner. Occasionally there's speculation they might have been able to save enough to eventually buy their freedom, although that must have been incredibly difficult.
Now, viewed through a modern lens, that compensation seems like just normal commerce, part of a transaction.
Of course. But in the Roman context, it's possible to interpret that compensation partly as necessary payment, not just for the service, but for enduring the extreme social degradation inherent in the infamous role.
Compensation for the shame.
Perhaps. They were fulfilling a role that was structurally necessary for elite dominance, but one that was considered socially abhorrent and legally degrading for the person performing it.
So this leads back to the source material's core argument, that Roman society essentially engineered a kind of moral transfer.
Exactly. The moral failing inherent in the passive role, the shame, the weakness, the morbus associated with the Pathicus, that was effectively transferred entirely onto the socially disposable caste, the infames.
It's like they created a designated group to bear the burden of that perceived shame.
Yes, a structural solution that provided a crucial outlet for elite male desire, allowing them full sexual gratification while simultaneously protecting their most valuable political and social asset, their masculine identity, their virtus. The whole system relied on condemning the choice of passivity in a citizen while institutionalizing the necessity of passive bodies from the lower strata.
And this institutional reliance, this channeling of desire onto acceptable objects, it's maybe most clearly demonstrated in how Roman society handled pederasty relationships between older men and younger males.
Yes, that's a very telling area.
We need to be careful with the term pederasty, though. When many listeners hear it, they probably think first of the ancient Greek model.
Right, which, although it was still deeply asymmetrical in terms of power, often claimed to incorporate elements of mentorship, education, maybe philosophical elevation alongside the obvious sexual component.
But Roman pederasty was different.
Very different, generally speaking. The Roman practice appears to have been almost entirely transactional, hierarchical, and defined strictly, rigidly, by the status of the youth involved.
Okay.
It typically involved an adult male citizen, the vir, and a younger male, usually a slave, sometimes a foreigner or freedman of low status, generally aged somewhere between, say, 12 and 20. The legal and social status of the young person was the single paramount determining factor of whether the relationship was acceptable or scandalous.
And here we find this really powerful social and legal barrier we touched on earlier, the protection afforded to the freeborn boy.
Absolutely crucial. The freeborn Roman boy was, to the greatest extent possible under law and custom, considered sexually untouchable by adult men.
And this protection was even symbolized visually, wasn't it? By the bulla.
Yes, the bulla. It was a protective amulet, usually a locket containing charms, worn around the neck by freeborn boys from infancy until they formally came of age. It was a clear visual marker of their protected status. Harming or sexually violating a boy wearing the bulla was a serious offense, potentially falling under laws like the Lex Scantinia itself if penetration was involved.
So the law wasn't protecting youth in general, but specifically protecting the future citizen.
Precisely. That's the deep significance here. The Roman legal and social system understood implicitly that passive penetration inherently degraded one's social status, made one soft or mollus. Therefore, they guarded the freeborn boy's sexual integrity fiercely, ensuring his future eligibility for virtus, for citizenship, for political command was not compromised before he even reached adulthood.
And then when that boy came of age, usually around 16 or 17, there was a formal ceremony, right?
Yes, a very important rite of passage. He would formally dedicate his bulla, along with the clippings from his first beard shaving, to the household gods, the lares. He'd put on the toga virilis, the toga of manhood. This ritual transition marked his official shift
From protected potential asset.
to mandatory sexual subject. A dominant citizen expected now to exercise his virtus, including sexually. He often came under the patronage of Liber, the god associated with male fertility and political liberty.
So the receptive role was only permissible, only socially conceivable, for a youth if he was legally and permanently barred from ever inheriting citizen status and the potential for virtus.
That's the core logic. For slaves and other youths of low status, the receptive act served as a literal defining mark of their station. It essentially confirmed whether that individual was on the path towards eventual social dominance, like the freeborn boy, or locked into a state of perpetual subservience and legal degradation. The sexual act itself became a kind of social and legal life sentence, reinforcing their place in the hierarchy.
Wow. It really drove home the status divisions at every level. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time on the moral framework, the legal structures, the sort of who could do what to whom, and the why behind it all, this obsession with status and virtus.
Yes, the underlying ideology.
But let's turn to the sources that give us a glimpse, how we're biased, into how these dynamics actually played out physically. We need to examine the evidence we have from things like literary invective and surviving art to try and ground these high-level concepts in the raw reality of Roman practice.
Right, the evidence for the acts themselves. And the literary sources, which are almost universally authored by elite male voices, are often incredibly explicit, surprisingly so to modern readers, especially when they're detailing anal penetration.
And the primary term they use for that is?
The verb pedicabo.
Yes.
It literally means I will sodomize. Its frequent use confirms that anal penetration was considered the default, the assumed sexual act when the receptive partner was male. This was the specific physical action that most clearly codified the power hierarchy in a sexual context.
And this language, it wasn't exactly subtle or euphemistic, was it?
Not in the slightest, especially when used in invective. Poets who specialized in satire and insult, and you think of figures like Catullus in the late Republic or Martial in the early Empire, they use these hyper-explicit descriptions of sexual acts as absolutely devastating tools for social and political mockery.
So these weren't just like private dirty jokes.
Oh no, these poems were often circulated publicly, performed at readings. They served to confirm the ubiquity, the common knowledge, and maybe even the accepted savagery of these dominance practices among the Roman elite. It was part of the cultural language of power.
And you mentioned Catullus. There's that infamous line, isn't there? Catullus 16.
Yes, probably the most notorious example. It's a short, incredibly brutal poem where Catullus responds to two critics who had apparently questioned his masculinity based on his supposedly particularly soft love poems.
And he responds by saying,
He opens with the incredibly aggressive, raw physical threat, framed entirely in terms of sexual dominance and force,
Vivo Bo!
which translates roughly as,
I will sodomize you, plural, and I will face fuck you.
wow, okay, it's direct.
Extremely. And it perfectly showcases how the physical act, pedicare, was tied explicitly to humiliation, to the violent assertion of superiority, and ultimately to a profound declaration of his own intact virtus against those who doubted it. It's aggression expressed through sexual threat.
And if we look beyond just the verbs, what about the specific language around physical positions? Did that carry moral coding too?
Yes, it seems it did. While respectable citizen wives, the matronae, were generally expected, at least in ideal depictions, to adopt positions associated with modesty and conception, perhaps lying supine.
Other positions were coded differently. Definitely. Positions that clearly maximize the penetrator's dominance and control, particularly penetration from behind, often referred to with phrases suggesting the receptive partner's loins were uplifted high. These were strongly associated in literature with harlots, with sexual license, and with lower status individuals.
So that moral association confirms that these dominance-maximizing positions were likely the norm in these status-based acts with receptive males.
It strongly suggests it. The physical reality was expected to reinforce the social hierarchy being enacted. Control was paramount.
Okay, so the literary sources give us this language of aggression, dominance, and specific acts. What about artistic evidence? Does that offer a different perspective?
Well, it offers a visual confirmation, which is incredibly valuable. And for this specific topic, male same-sex acts in a status context, the single most important artifact we have is almost certainly the Warren Cup.
Ah, yes, the Warren Cup. Tell us about it.
It's a magnificent silver drinking cup, likely made in the early 1st century CE, probably in Julio-Claudian times. It's incredibly high-quality craftsmanship.
And what's depicted on it?
It features 2 detailed, raised scenes reliefs showing male same-sex acts. One scene shows an older, bearded man penetrating a younger man while a slave looks on. The other scene shows 2 younger men, perhaps closer in age, engaged in a similar act.
And the very existence of this cup, what does that tell us? It's a luxury item.
Exactly. It was functional, almost certainly used at elite Roman dinner parties, convivia. Its existence confirms that these acts weren't just happening, they were common enough, discussed enough, and accepted enough within the elite context to be depicted openly, even celebrated visually on high-status objects, provided, of course, that the implied hierarchy was maintained.
So how is that hierarchy shown on the cup? How do we decode the dominance?
Well, one key detail is what the active partners are wearing. In both scenes, the penetrating figure is depicted wearing a wreath or crown made of leaves. Specifically, it looks like myrtle.
Myrtle. What's the significance of myrtle?
Myrtle had several associations. It was linked to Venus, the goddess of love, but importantly, it was also used in specific lesser military ceremonies, particularly the corona ovalis, the ovation crown.
The ovation was a lesser triumph, right? For victories won without much bloodshed.
Exactly. So one strong interpretation put forward in the source analysis is that this myrtle crown symbolizes that the homosexual penetration depicted was perhaps viewed metaphorically as an easy victory over the subordinate partner.
Wow. So the receptive body is literally transformed into a kind of stylized trophy.
That's the argument. It becomes a visual articulation of the penetrator's mastery and control. The artwork confirms that these acts, at least in this elite representation, weren't primarily about mutual pleasure or affection. They were demonstrations of one man's inherent power and high status being enacted upon the body, and implicitly the lower status of the other.
So the act of bottoming in this cultural context becomes a visual statement of subservience, memorialized in silver.
Precisely. The art reinforces the same power dynamics we see in the literature and the law.
But all of this evidence, whether it's the savage poetic invective or the sophisticated artistry of the Warren Cup, it brings us face to face with what feels like the most profound limitation in all the sources we have on this topic, doesn't it?
Yes. It's the critical silence, the missing voices.
Exactly. Despite knowing the precise legal status distinctions, the specific vocabulary of contempt like Pathicus and senatus, the assumed physical act, pedicabo, even the likely positions employed by the penetrator.
Despite all that detail from one perspective,
We have virtually no primary source insight whatsoever into the emotional, the physical, or the personal lived experience of the receptive partner.
the slave boy being used by his master, the adult Exoletus trying to make a living, Even the politically destroyed citizen Pathicus facing ruin. Their voices are almost completely absent from the historical record that has survived to us.
If they wrote anything down, if they expressed their feelings or experiences, it hasn't survived. Or perhaps they were never in a position to record it in the first place.
And this silence, it isn't just accidental, is it? It's not just bad luck of preservation. It powerfully reinforces the central fact. Roman sexuality, as it was recorded and transmitted, was documented almost exclusively from the perspective of the active, dominant, elite male. His concerns, his status anxiety, his assertion of power, that's what fills the texts and the art. The receptive body, in this framework, was often treated as little more than an object upon which the penetrator inscribed and affirmed his own power and identity. Their silence is, in a way, the ultimate and most tragic testament to their subjugation within that system.
A really sobering point to end the main discussion on #Tagatro.
Yeah.
Okay, we have journeyed through a really complex and frankly quite brutal social and sexual system today. Let's just try and recap the core structure one last time.
It really boils down to a central contradiction.
Right.
The receptive role was, on the one hand, structurally essential to elite male sexual expression. The system absolutely relied on having a cast of acceptable bottoms available, yet simultaneously, that very same role was the most potent source of social and political anxiety imaginable for any citizen who might willingly assume it or even be accused of assuming it.
So ultimately, the experience of the receptive male in ancient Rome was entirely, inescapably defined by his legal status.
Absolutely. For the free citizen, the Pathicus, any willing submission was framed as a moral failure, a sickness, morbus, and a potentially fatal political liability that could be weaponized by rivals using tools like the Lex Scantinia. It was a direct threat to his fundamental identity as a ver.
But then, for the vast majority of receptive males, the countless slaves, the vulnerable young non-citizens, the professional exoleti marked by infamia,
For them, the receptive act wasn't a moral choice. It was purely a function of their legally degraded status. Their bodies were effectively commodities, designated as accessible, precisely to allow the entire highly rigid system of Roman power and citizenship to persist without compromising the status of the elite men who used them.
So the answer to our initial question, how did bottoms have sex in ancient Rome? It really isn't a simple physical description at all, is it?
Not at all. It was a complex, legally codified social mechanism, a system that explicitly and often brutally enforced the hierarchies of citizenship, property, freedom, and power directly through the control and definition of the human body and its roles in sexual acts.
Which leaves us with a truly thought-provoking final question for you, the listener, to ponder. If our modern society, at least aspirationally, tends to define sexual identity based on who we love and desire, focusing on an internal definition of affection and orientation.
Rome defined sexual identity based entirely on who held power over whom. Emotion and preference were largely irrelevant to the social meaning of the act. So the final thought is this. How far does that historical echo, the Roman echo of status-based sexual morality, the intense anxiety about dominance versus submission, still shape our unspoken social biases and cultural pressures today? Particularly, perhaps, a pervasive fear of perceived weakness or submission, especially for men. The legacy of Roman virtus and the shame of its opposite might be a much more deeply embedded cultural pressure than we often realize. Something incredibly hard to escape, even now.